Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Module 7 of Theophania's Foundations of the Craft course. My name is Gwendolyn Reese, and I am very excited to have you with me today. So this module, Module 7, is actually the last module of the course. So we will go through the theory and then the praxis section. So thank you so much for everyone who is joining me on this particular adventure. So I'm really happy to have spent this time with you, and I hope that it has been useful. So now let's go ahead and get started into the next section. So today we're going to talk a bit about altars. We're also going to talk about building a regular personal practice. We're going to go through some ritual essentials, and then I'm going to give you some suggestions for how you can build on the foundation that you have been creating here within the context of this course. So let's talk a little bit about altars. Pagans love altars. So I want to explain a little bit about how they function, why we might want to use them, but I also want to be clear that altars are not technically necessary, although they have a lot of value. So some of the purposes for altars. Altars are typically really good interface points. And what I mean by that is that an altar, especially a permanent altar that you might have within your home, something along those lines, they are places that you go to do sacred work. And what that means is that after you have consecrated them and you are using them on a more regular basis, that when you go and approach the altar, it both signals in a kind of entrainment way your non-talking parts of self, so your dreaming self and your higher self. It gives them the signal that they should become engaged, active, and what you are about to do requires their participation in a more conscious way. It also signals any particular beings that you frequently work with that you may have devoted aspects of your altar to, that you are approaching with that intent. This is particularly important for those of us who do more of the devotional work. So for example, on my main altar, I have Apollon and Athena, and I have statues of them, and I have candles that I light, and it's places where I make offerings to them. And so when I go and I begin firing up the altar, it both tells me that I'm about to do sacred work, but it also is like a switchboard where it tells these particular great ones that I work with on a regular basis that I am approaching. So that is part of this. It's, like I said, these interface points. Another thing about altars is that they can hold sacred objects. So we spent a long time in the last module talking about sacred tools. And, most witches, most pagans, they have sacred tools. And if you have sacred tools, you either need to put them away in special places that are, set aside as something that is important, or you can have them on an altar so that they are readily accessible for use. The other thing, when we went through and we talked about spellcrafting in the last module, a lot of times when you're doing sacred work, you actually do need a work surface. So that's another way in which altars function, is kind of as your work surface. Now, altars can be permanent or they can be temporary. So a lot of times, we'll go through this in a minute, you might create an altar that is very specific to a particular ritual or a particular spell that you're casting, as opposed to doing it on your main altar. You can also create an altar if you are doing a working that is over the course of a period of time. Like, let's say that you, over the course of a year, have taken on some major project. You might make an altar specifically to that initiative that, you are setting up, and all of the work that you do around that initiative is done at that altar. So, let's say you are taking upon yourself a chance to do some really deep soul healing on some particular issue. Then you might make a healing altar that is specific for yourself, like I'm going to heal my relationship with my body or something along those lines. And all of the stuff that you do that manifests your intention, and when you're calling in the energy, and maybe there's deities that you're working with or allies that you're working with, you could create an altar that you keep for the period of time while you were doing that. And that can be very powerful. The other thing is that, like I said, many of us do have permanent altars that we use for particular, like for our main work. I have 3 that I actually use for my main work. I have my main altar that has Apollon and Athena and some other stuff that has to do with my main work. I also have a household altar that has to do with the spirits that I work with in terms of my household. And then I have one that is dedicated to the work that I do for the good of the polis. And that is work that is ongoing for me. In addition to that, I have a number of other altars that are functional altars or are dedicated to particular deities that I work with, but maybe not all the time. So for example, I have a healing altar because I frequently will do healing work for others, or at least, when they're like, oh no, something is happening, and I will light a candle on that altar. I have an altar that is dedicated to Hermes. Because Hermes is both, I end up working with him a lot in terms of psychopomp work. He is a guide of the dead. So when someone has died, I will do a prayer and work with Hermes specifically for them to have a safe and easy passage, or when they are in the process of dying. But I also, Hermes is very important for travel. Do a lot of travel. So, doing various kinds of work of that nature if you have particular beings that you work with. But I want to point out again that you don't have to have altars, and it is very important to be practical. So it may be that you don't have the space to have altars. That certainly is the case for many of us. I lived in a less than 400 square foot apartment for many years, and I had one very small permanent altar, and that was it. And, I have lived in places before where, because of roommates or whatever, that I could not really have a permanent altar. So, do what you need to do. You can always create an altar on the fly and then put everything away. Also, if you've ever seen in many Hindu households, they have very, very tiny altars. That is also a possibility. There's lots and lots of different possibilities for you. And like I said, good, better, best. It's amazing and wonderful. I can tell you that, if you do have the luxury of having a permanent altar in which you can do work over and over and over again, it does actually make that work easier and deeper. It does help, but never let that get out of, the ability for the good, because there are other times in which I have lived in circumstances, and I have some stuff. I live in an apartment. So there's places that I go that are outside, and they don't have anything physically obvious to anyone, but I go to the same bush and I make my libations at the same bush every time. And that also functions as an altar. Okay, so let's talk a little bit though about like what does go on a ritual altar, because we've been talking some about more permanent altars, but we also do create altars typically for rituals. So first of all, most of the time you're going to have an altar cloth, and the altar cloth can be in a color that has to do with the correspondence of the energy that you're trying to bring in. So if I was trying to get a job, let's say I was trying to do something where I was doing a ritual, but that's a spell. That's a spell. I would probably do orange then. But okay. So if I'm doing something that is seasonal, I'm doing a ritual for Imbolc in the winter. I have a silvery, sparkly with snowflakes all over it altar cloth that I put on that kind of evokes that feeling. There are times in which I have, that you can have color correspondence. You can also have things, that's the easiest, is just color correspondence. And we went through some of the colors in module 6. But I have another one that I use a lot because I do so much work in the Greek system. I have one that has symbols on it that are very important to me. So it's blue, which is expansive. It also is kind of the Greek national color. And it has griffins that are woven into it. And griffins are very important in the Hellenic system, and they are also very protective. So a lot of times I use that as the main altar. So the main altar cloth, because it both pulls in a lot of the kinds of energy, the devotional energy that I'm often working with, but it also calls to particular beings have a very protective aspect to them. You know, it is not uncommon if you have the luxury of space to really have 5 altars in a circle, you know. And again, this is all like if you have the luxury of space, and there's a lot of different ways that you can set up different altars, but it's pretty common to have a main altar in the middle or towards one of the quarters, and then to have a quarter altar in each, so that you have, for instance, in the West, you might have a candle that is associated with the colors of the West, and you might have an altar cloth that is the colors that you associate with the West, and you might have a statue of a being that is associated with water. You might have seashells, you know, any number of things to make it kind of beautiful and call to water. And you might have your tool of the chalice there. So that's very common to have at each of the 4 quarters, the elemental colors and tools and other things that call to those energies. And then to have in the center kind of your main altar. Or like I said, sometimes that is in one of the quarters as well, if you were doing work specifically to one of the quarters. So it's also the ritual tools then, they can be in the altars that are for the quarters, but anything that you are actually going to use in the ritual that's a ritual tool, you're going to actually need it, you probably want that somewhere on the altar so that you're not running around looking for it. So all of those will be typically on your ritual altar. Any materia that you might need for the ritual. Often I have a devotional aspect, and I often work with spirits. So I often will have statues, and I often do make offerings as part of the ritual. So I will typically have a vessel in which I can pour libations. And then after the ritual, I typically take them out, as I said, to that particular bush and make the formal libation onto the ground after the ritual. And then, you know, things to make it beautiful, things to speak to that dreaming aspect of self, the dreaming self, the lower self. That's the one that has that kind of childlike wonder and loves beauty and like, isn't amazing? And that's what you really want to evoke, because that is the aspect of self that really has the power for ritual. And so, you know, anything that you can do that will help speak to that aspect of self is really important. On a permanent altar, you know, again, your magical tools, if you have magical tools, they should either be carefully put away in some sort of special way that is respectful to the tool and, you know, has that, or they can live on an altar. You can have statues if that's kind of your thing. Candles, these are very common. You know, there's the candle magic. You can dress the candles, the different colors, you know, inscribe them with various kinds of intention. But the other thing about them, which I think that I have mentioned before, but just in case I haven't, you know, when you light a candle, the flame, there's typically a dark area in the flame. That can be a doorway that you can open and invite a spirit through, invite a God through. So, or invite your own higher self, kind of, you know, there's a ability to reach in with your consciousness and kind of pull through from there. So candles are really useful. And I usually have, they also are a form of offering. So I usually have candles going in front of many of the statues here. And then whatever materia you have for your personal practice that you need. Now, for both the ritual altars and for your permanent altars, beware of ritual detritus. This is really, really, really easy to end up with just a whole bunch of stuff on your altar, especially for devotional types, in which, like, I love Apollon, and, and oh, here's all of these things that I think he would like. And suddenly I've surrounded his statue with just all sorts of detritus. And then that stuff has to come off. If you are looking at something, you're like, this does not actually serve in this moment, I'm not using it. It can really clog up the energy of your interface point. So, take a look at your altar, and if you've got things on there and you don't know why, then it is time for them to come off. So I'm just going to say that because it's really easy. The other thing is, once you have an altar, if you have a permanent altar, it needs to only really be used for that. You can't go piling other stuff on it. If you have it out in the main area of your living space and you have guests over, you want to keep them from like putting their red Solo cup on during a house party, something like that. So you need to like let people know, which is kind of an argument to not having every surface in your house become an altar, which is also an easy thing for pagans to start to do. So I'm just kind of warning you about that. I use a lot of the tops of bookcases. The other thing is, if you have permanent altars, you do need to pay some attention to them periodically and use them to keep that energy sort of flowing. But if you have the luxury, I would recommend at least one area, one permanent altar that you go to that is kind of like your main practice area. I think it really does help a lot if you have that luxury, understanding that not everyone does, and never let the best be the enemy of the good. But again, I do also just want to mention, like if you look into various sorts of Hindu traditions, a lot of those altars, they can be very small. They can be very small, and you can close them and open them. There's all sorts of different things that you can be creative with. And this is a part for you to use that aspect of self, that dreaming self, the self that has the constant capacity for like childlike wonder, to help you design your altars in ways that are meaningful and pleasing to you. So now I do want to talk a little bit about regular personal practice. So whether or not you are a solitaire, meaning that you practice, you are not a part of a group, or if you are a part of a group that does ritual together, such as a coven, a lodge, a grove, any number of different, configurations for this, I still believe that your personal practice is actually the most important. That you can always kind of tell when you are in a group in which people don't have adequate personal practice, because they're not really able to contribute in the way they would be able to if they had a stable practice on their own. So I'm a really big believer that it's important for everyone to have a personal practice. And the most important part of that is regular. This is in a lot of ways spiritual growth, spiritual work. It's, imagine like you wouldn't think it would be reasonable for someone to lift a whole bunch of heavy weights once a month and think that is going to do anything for them other than possibly hurt them. So it's a similar kind of situation. It's like, the regularity of the practice is what makes you have progress. So the big thing here, and this is something that I just want to acknowledge is difficult for everyone, is you have to find a way to make it actually fit into your life in order to accomplish real regular practice. And part of that, which is the part that we tend to focus on, is choosing to make the commitment that you're going to do this, and it's going to be something that's important, and you're really going to do it. But I'm going to say, I think the actual place where most people fall down, and where when I fall down, it is the issue, is in also making it what I'm calling spiritually ergonomic, which means that, you're fitting it in a way that actually works with the rest of your life. Because we are really, really over busy and over committed people by and large. And a lot of times our expectations for ourselves and the expectations that we take on and make commitments to are often coming from an imaginative place of a life that is far more ideal than the one we actually are living. And what that can do is begin to make you not only, not do what you think you have committed to do, but it can make you resentful about it. And that is a very bad thing. And it can also make you feel like a failure. And that is a very bad thing. So I am going to encourage us all to be realistic about the kinds of lives that we are living and to find ways to make our spiritual life ergonomic in terms of fitting into our full existing life. And part of that is to recognize that we need to revisit periodically and ask whether or not we can still do, what it is that we're doing or what's happening in our lives. So as an example here, I'm just going to use myself as an example. There was a time many years ago when I would spend pretty reliably 2.5 to 3 hours every single day doing spiritual work. And that was amazing. It was so amazing to be able to do that. And it was deeply enriching. And in so many ways, I was growing so quickly, and it was just incredible. And there's a few different things there. I did not have even the tiniest fraction of the levels of responsibility that I have now. I just really didn't. I mean, I had a lot more time. I didn't have the kinds of commitments that I have to have now. And in addition to that, I was younger and I needed a lot less sleep. And I got a lot less sleep. And so, all of these things are very real. I cannot do 2.5 to 3 hours on a daily basis anymore. And in a certain way that makes me sad, but it's also like, rather than beating myself up and feeling like a failure because I'm not doing what I was doing when my life was really different, is to find ways to make it spiritually ergonomic. Because I also think in a lot of ways, I'm contributing more now than I was then. So my recommendation here is to establish your bare minimum. And for that, I think that if we establish like, this is our bare minimum, that if we do this, then we have succeeded for the day and everything else is addition. And that way we've got good, better, best. Establish what good is and make it the bare minimum. Make it something you can do when you are on vacation. Make it something that you can do when you are in a hospital bed. Make it something that you can do when you are feeling really awful. So, something that is truly bare minimum. And then include some reward that works for you. So I am suggesting that there are a number of functions that you include in your bare minimum. The first one is some form of purification and cleaning. The next is some form of protection. And then you need to attend to the immortal aspects of yourself. And if you are in a particular relationship with one of the great ones or more than one of the great ones or the spirits, you have to attend to your relationships. So those are kind of the bare minimum, or those are the functions that need to go into whatever your practice is, including the bare minimum. So at least 3, maybe 4, just have to be in there. So these all, I think if we find ways to do these, then we can build on them and we can have a more elaborate practice. But I'm going to suggest that you find some bare minimum ways to do all of these. And then, like I said, you can also then plan for your normal day and then your special day. And there's a lot of different ranges here. So for purification and cleaning, we've talked about like in the shower, you just run through your chakras while you're in the shower. Maybe you're not able to be in the shower because you are in a hospital bed. You can still go in and run through the chakras and cleanse them. Okay. So like having something that is like that. And I mean, that can just be like, you know, your bare minimum. And maybe you want to keep that for like your everyday, or maybe as part of your everyday, you also want to scent yourself with incense, or, you know, do some water or something, some salt water. You may want to do that, or maybe not. Maybe you want to stay with the bare minimum. And then on like a special day, you could do a full lustral bath and all sorts of different things. But on some level, even on the bare minimum, just like, and it does not take long at all, run through, do some purification. Protection, bare minimum, I would say, you know, do shields up and check your shields and see whether or not you got any weak spots and like fix those. Bare minimum. You can do that. You can do that in a hospital bed, and it doesn't take long. You know, obviously you can do more, or you could just stay with that on a normal day. And then on like a special day in which you're really redoing all of your wards and your shields, you know, you might have something that's more elaborate. Attending to the immortal aspects of self. We went through in the very, very first session about trying to establish some way of talking to yourself, to that aspect of the self that doesn't typically have voice. I'm going to recommend that you do that. I'm also going to share here. This is an image that is from the Mnemosyne affirmation, which the image was created by Ivo Dominguez Jr. on our behalf. And it was based on an image that I got from Apollon. And then the Mnemosyne affirmation came through as well. So this is something that I do for myself every day, just as a quick, you know, affirming who I am. Remember who you are. Remember what you are. You are the radiance of the light eternal. You are beauty, beholding the beautiful. You are the love that is moved by wonder. Call yourself back to yourself and remember. Strike your own true note and then feel all within tune and harmonize. You are a singer in the cosmic song. Tune yourself and sing. And so part of my bare minimum is I will tell myself that. And if I can, which I usually can, but I guess maybe I wouldn't if I was in a hospital bed, I look at, you know, this picture. So something along those lines, you know, it can be as simple as reminding yourself of all of your names. It can be holding on to a coin that is from your birth year and saying, you know, I am Gwendolyn and I am born in this time and in this place in order to bring light into this world. I am more than this body. I am blah, 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 you know, whatever it is that is meaningful to you, but just take a moment and connect with the immoral aspect of yourself. But, you know, have it be something that you can do fast. You know, you can ask yourself how you're doing. You could use a pendulum. You could use the, you know, you can use this kind of thing of yes, no, that we went through in the first episode, the first module. And then, like I said, if you have a specific relationship to one of the great ones, if that is a part of it, or to particular spirits, then doing something to attend to those relationships, you know, even if it's just reaching out in your mind and saying something that is a ritual affirmation, you know, and asking them how they're doing, or just, you know, something along those lines. So those things there, some quick prayer. So that's what I would say for bare minimum. And then figure out, like, what does your normal day look like? What is your normal day that you can figure out? You know, so you're not completely pressed. But, you know, what do you want to add on to that? And then, like I said, you can think a little bit about what's your special day. And here's some suggestions for additions. So, you know, if you have your bare minimum, then you can add like meditation or contemplation is a great thing to add. Offerings with prayers, some sort of communing with, you know, spirits that you're working with. You can have regular personal rituals that you do. There's a lot of different types there. Journaling and dream journaling are really powerful practices that you could add in. And so, you know, a lot of this is like, what is it that is most important to you, that speaks to you, that you want to build? Spirit work, such as journeying. And like I said, there's the communing with spirits, and then there's the kind of astral work that you go and work with the spirits in that way. You might want to have a regular divination practice, like maybe you draw a tarot card a day, something along those lines. There's a lot of different ways that you can put in. I try to do a lot of paying attention to omens as just part of my practice. There's sacred art practice. If you are an artist, if you are a writer, if you're a musician, something where, you are incorporating some sacred art into your regular practice. You can do chanting. A lot of us do chanting. I actually, my form of meditation that works best is a form of mantra meditation personally. And I do a lot of chanting and studying. I consider, if you do it with sacred intentions, studying. So those are just some kinds of things that you could add into your daily practice, but establish that bare bones minimum, the thing that you can do where you're like, all right, I have successfully done my practice. And then what is it that motivates you for that? What's your reward? So for me, I am a list person. I like to check things off. It's how I organize my life. And so having something where I can check things off and keep a streak going, that motivates me, but maybe it doesn't motivate everybody. Maybe part of your practice is like, if you do this, your reward is that you get to have a cup of coffee. And in that time, when you are silent with the coffee, you are communing with some spirits, whatever it is that really, speaks to you, that would be feeling like a reward. Some other considerations here is that really, all of life is sacred. So I really do believe that walking through life with sacred intention is practice. But I do think those functional pieces of clearing out, establishing the protection, and at least connecting intentionally to your higher self in some way, those should be for everybody. And like I said, if you have major sacred relationships, you always need to attend to relationships, be they human, your pet, your animal friend, and the spirits. It's like any of these are relationships. Your plants, you don't get to neglect relationships. Relationships always need care and feeding. But something like that. And then the most important thing to me is going through life with a sacred intention and trying to exist in the moment on various levels of reality. And then the other part as a consideration is that if you do have a specialization or a particular calling, there may be other requirements for regular practice. There is a difference between someone like me who sings in the shower and someone who's a true musician. Someone who's a true musician must practice. There's just no way around it. So if you have a particular specialization or calling, there may be additional requirements beyond the bare bones minimum. Okay, so now let's go into a little bit of ritual essentials. And this can work in individual rituals, obviously, but I'm mostly talking at this point about group rituals. So for those people who are taking this actually with me, we've been doing group rituals as part of, our class, and people are tending to attend the coven rituals as well. So I want to go through some of the core ritual components here. And many of these, as you will note, we've covered. If you've gone through and done this, then we've actually covered pretty much all of them. And you should be able to participate and even create some of these. So grounding and centering, where we are connecting with all the aspects of self, and we are connecting with the sacred earth, and we're connecting with all of the powers. It typically starts pretty much every ritual. Creation of ritual purification, again, of the self, of the space, creating the container for sacred space. And most commonly that's a circle. A circle is an easy one to do, and there are reasons why we love it. It is awesome. There are other forms, but something where the boundaries around the sacred space are created. So that keeps the energy contained. It often has somewhat of a protective aspect, but it also creates the focus. And then typically there are invocations for whatever beings you are asking to participate or inviting in. And then in the middle is what I'm just calling the work. And that is whatever the work of the ritual is. And we'll go through in a minute. There are so many different forms that this can take. This is a real creative path. You can do a lot. So, we have this kind of structure that we're setting up. And once you've done that, and I should mention with the invocations, if you're not working with any spirits, you don't have to invoke anything. So that's only if you're working with spirits, but often we do. So then you have the work, and then frequently, not always, but frequently we have something that we call cakes and ale, which is almost never cake and almost never ale. But it is where we will frequently bring some food and drink that we will share in sacred space with each other. And we will also leave a portion for the gods for libations and offerings later, the gods and spirits. And part of that is to spend time in community. There's something very deep and really primal about sharing food together, these laws of hospitality and the bonding of, human beings are very social animals, and this is some of the very first social activity that, we have, right? So cakes and ale, the other piece of that is that this is where we accept the abundance from the earth, from nature, and from the spirits and the gods, and from each other. And we accept that abundance as a gift, and we have gratitude for it. And then typically after we have done that, we give gratitude for all of the beings who have assisted us in the work. And we also then dismiss them. And some of the very traditional ways, go if you must, stay if you will. We bid you hail and farewell. And the really, really traditional kind of British traditional Wicca way is, and as you depart for your lovely realms, we do bid you hail and farewell. Should you run into some of those kind of phrases, that's kind of more traditional Wiccan stuff. And then typically we take down the container so that we are now transitioning out of sacred space back into everyday reality, which is also sacred, but it doesn't have quite that function, that focus, sorry. And then typically there is an ending, and the ending that is most common among Wiccans is merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. But there can be others, the work is done and it is well done is another that is very common, where what we're doing is, we're calling an end to it and we're sending this out into the cosmos. So there's lots and lots of things that can make up that main work. So basically the thing is, whatever your ritual is, you want to have a clearly defined intention. And in many rituals that I and others create, part of what we do is often say somewhere in the ritual, in ritual space, this is what our intention is, this is what we're doing. And there's a real, good case to be made for that, so that everyone is on the same page, because pagan rituals are not like the kind of church rituals that I grew up with, at any rate, in which most of the action is taking place like, up in the ministers or whatever in the choir. They are deeply participatory. Every single person is making that magic. Every single person is a participant in the ritual. And so you really want everyone understanding what it is that you are trying to accomplish. So there's lots of different intentions, and the methods that you're going to choose need to match those intentions. And we frequently mix these up. We can do numerous of them. So, one of them is just celebration. Celebration and gratitude is a completely appropriate intention for a ritual in which, you are giving thanks, and we are celebrating victory, or we are celebrating having survived, or we are celebrating the coming of spring. Any of these things, this is all very appropriate, and it gives it sacred meaning. Often we'll do some astral work or path working. This is when we want some sort of change to be occurring or some sort of experience to be had in the other worlds. And so, if you have a bunch of people who are very, very well trained in astral work, you can do this without a path working. In other words, you can say, and now we will go into the astral and we will do whatever. And then we all just go do it. And we'll have, you've got people that are well enough trained that they know how to do it and have some group cohesion. But for the most part, if what you are attempting to do is to go into the other worlds, into those aspects and those levels of reality that are not normal waking reality. And you want people to act in some way in concert and have something of a similar experience. Doing it as a path working is a very useful technique. And there's a lot to learn about path workings. And like I said, that is not, that's not a foundational skill. Participating in a path working, I think, is, but there are a lot of skills in terms of like writing and giving a path working, but that's a form. Divine embodiment. So there's a lot of different forms of this. This is where you allow one of the great ones or a different kind of spirit to come into you and use your body as a vehicle. And there's, again, that is not a beginner skill. There's a lot of different forms of it, from drawing down, aspecting, various forms of divine possession. And, you know, we do that to allow one of the great ones to be able to do things on this plane that are very visceral and that can be very deeply moving. We do this a lot in initiations. Also, the oracular work that some of us do, like the oracular work that I do with Apollon, that's a divine embodiment kind of situation. Sacred theater. Sacred theater, if it's done really well, is actually a form of divine embodiment in a lot of cases. But this is where you are doing actions that are scripted. But, you know, I mean, theater has its roots in sacred ritual, specifically Dionysiac ritual. But in so doing, you are also creating in the level of the astral and the manifest, and building bridges across for certain things to occur. And when it is done well, it is amazingly, amazingly powerful. It's amazingly powerful. It can have very, very real effects when it is done well. When it is done badly, it can be like really terrible community theater. So, you know, that's something, again, you know, there's a lot of this has some important skill and art to continue to develop. You can just commune in sacred space. One of the things that we sometimes do in various kinds of rituals, and I'm just going to throw a few of them out here. There's a ritual that the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel does. It's incredibly potent. It's amazing, if I do say so myself, even though, I mean, I didn't design it and I've actually never been a priestess in it. I've just participated, but it's one in which it's done around Samhain. Typically it's audience with the ancestors, and they use as part of it ashes of some of our beloved dead, and we seed over an aspect, a part of the land temporarily in this very elaborate kind of ritual structure to the dead. And you can go one at a time into a particular area that has become a crossroads that's been temporarily seeded over to the dead, and you can actually commune with your ancestors, and is really powerful. And so that would be an aspect of communing in sacred space. I've done other rituals in which, you know, people go and they do some particular kinds of divinatory scrying or something along those lines. There's various forms of ritual actions taking place on multiple levels of being. So I'll give you another example of that. There's a ritual that I designed that has to do with curse breaking, and it has to do with curse breaking curses that were cast in past lives. And, you know, as part of this, there's a lot of taking the energy that is there, getting it into a manifest form, onto a pot shard, and then smashing the heck out of the pot shard to break the curse. So, you know, part of what you have to do in order to do this kind of work is you have to get it into some sort of form that you can then destroy. And so there are ritual actions that we are actually doing that you can see, but there's a lot of stuff that's also going on in those other aspects of self. So those are ritual actions conducted, some of which are visible, a lot of which is invisible, but it is having effects on all of these different levels of being. Promises and empowerments. A lot of this is, you know, You see this in a lot of initiatory work in which we're also doing empowerment for people, working often on their subtle bodies and on various other aspects of being. But there's a lot of power too. There's a lot of power in asking people to make, and you got to be careful with this, because when you ask people to make promises within sacred space, then there's real ramifications to not doing that, but enabling them to have power. So, for example, again, there's a ritual that that I had created that has to do with helping people find some of their aspects of service. And I had a number of different altars set up with different sacred beings that were being embodied by various people. And, to see which way their heart moved them towards, like, are they more of, is their work to be a healer? Is their work to be a visionary? Is their work to be a tender of the hearth fire? Is their work to be a warrior protector? And having them go and then do some scrying and then make whatever the promise was in their heart, in terms of claiming that role for themselves. And then you can do evocation, which is where you are really calling down into more, material manifestation, something that exists predominantly on one of the more subtle aspects of being. So those are just some, but it really kind of depends on, like, what's your intention. And your intention throughout all of your rituals may just be celebration and gratitude. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's super important. So lots and lots of different things here that I just wanted to give you a taste. Most of these skills are things that do require a little bit more expertise, but a lot of them now, you've got a foundation, you can move forward. So some considerations if you are designing good rituals. I'm going to thank Ivo Dominguez Jr., who is a masterful designer of rituals, for this particular metaphor, which is, he said, some people are toasters and some people are steam irons. And I love this because I'm such a toaster. So, the toasters, we get hot really, really fast. And, we can get in there, get in the zone, and man, we're ready to go. And then if there's like not enough to keep you kind of moving along, then we'll fall out of it, right? So so we're the toasters. We get hot fast, but you got to keep us doing stuff or we're going to fall out of the zone. And then steam irons are the ones who just take a really long time to warm up. And once they're there, then they tend to stay there. So, and I actually have used that metaphor for other things too, because I find that this often works in communication as well. Like I am so totally a toaster. I get there really, really fast, and then you got to keep me engaged. And then, my dad is a classic steam iron where, if we're out doing something, by about 45 minutes, he'll start talking. So, so trying to figure out how to keep both of these kinds of personalities engaged in your ritual to give enough time for the steam irons to really get moving and get everything going, but without having the toasters drop out. You also, we talk about the various aspects of self, like there's the talking middle self, the rational self, there's that dream self, and then there's the kind of higher self, that higher spiritual self. You need to do things in your ritual, ideally, that will pull in all of those aspects of self, but you especially really, really need that dreaming self, because again, that's the power. That's the powerhouse. And so some of the things that the dreaming self really likes is, like, they like things that are beautiful. They like things that have songs and rhymes and rhythm. And so, some of this kind of chanting and singing and various things like that appeals, and putting that in at various places. Things like, scent, having good incense, that's something that tends to appeal. Anything that helps you cultivate wonder. Be it stories, anything like that all appeals to the lower self. And then another thing that can often be important, especially for the middle self, is remind people to give themselves permission to experience, because that's usually the middle self that's getting in the way, the part that's like sitting around thinking, well, I don't want to be rude. Or, that's one, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to be out of place. Another one is the kind of like, is this safe? And so, or I'm not good enough. That's all middle self stuff typically. So reminding people to give them permission and to trust themselves can be an important thing to sometimes do in this. But the other thing, as I mentioned, is, it is not a spectator sport. And so you want to be including things where you're giving directions to people about like what they should be participating in, how they should be, sending their energy. You need to give them some directions around that kind of stuff so that they're not just like falling into frankly, kind of consumer mode. We are really, really well trained in the society to be passive consumers, and that is exactly anathema to this path. So sometimes giving people clues is really important. You also, if you're doing a big public ritual, you want to have trained people assigned to be of support. So sometimes one of the things that can happen is that if you have someone who's fairly new to this sort of work, or even if they're, not new to this sort of work, but have a lot going on, where they may not have great energy management, you can have some people that will just get overwhelmed. And, it's a good idea to have some people on, if you have a big enough ritual, to have some people kind of on point to be the ones that will like go over and help somebody out and help them ground some of the excess energy out or do whatever is necessary without disrupting the ritual. And then another thing is, if you're designing a ritual, you always want to make sure there's at least a little bit of food and drink afterwards to help people ground and integrate, because this can be a lot of energy expenditure, and that is something that's often needed, especially, honestly, protein. So I want to talk a little bit about ritual etiquette. Should you be going to someone else's ritual? A couple of things. Remind yourself that every single ritual has the potential to be transformative. And remind yourself that that is the case so that you can be there. Another one that's just very basic is be on time. I mean, there's a lot of people that go on pagan standard time, and I will have none of that. Be on time. One of the things that we frequently do when we're designing a ritual is say, okay, gather is at X, and then the ritual starts at Y. And don't come after Y. Like, unless you specifically have called and they know you're coming and they're okay with it, just don't bother. Don't come walking into the middle of a ritual, because, if you need to make it on time, because you can't have people necessarily joining late. Another thing that's just good etiquette is, offering to help set up or clean up, whoever it is that is hosting the ritual. We do not have barely any professional clergy. And so almost everyone is volunteer, and helping people set up and clean up is just good guest behavior. In the ritual, if someone is having a strong emotional reaction, unless you've specifically been asked in advance to help, just don't. And the reason why is that a lot of times what people really need to do is have that strong emotional reaction. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And, trying to get past the point of being like socially uncomfortable with that is part of this work. But, if you really are concerned, like somebody seems to really be in trouble, signal the clergy in charge, or hopefully if it's a big ritual, they will have told you like who the people are if you have problems, or what to do. Another thing is that you want to hold sacred space for everyone. So let's say, every ritual has the potential to be transformative, but let's just say you're just not feeling it. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's not really important for someone else. So being there, being present, and being with the intention of like, may I contribute to this being a sacred place so that whoever it is that does need to have this transformation is able to have it, is kind of an important thing. And honestly, this is a form that I do when I am visiting, rituals and sacred space for other religions. Is, I am there. It's like, this is not for me, but I am there to hold sacred space for anyone who needs to be touched by this. I do that a lot. And then the other thing is, if you are in a ritual and you yourself are in trouble in the middle of the ritual, there's a few different things. If everybody is standing, you can sit down and raise your hand. You can go to an appropriate leader discreetly, or follow whatever the instructions are that they have given you for that. You know, if you are in trouble, you need to get help. And so figuring out how to do that is a good thing, because, you know, especially we don't want anyone having like a medical situation, which does actually sometimes happen, especially if it's a long ritual and somebody forgot to like eat enough or something. So, you know, figuring that out so that you can do it in a way that is not totally disrupting to the ritual. But if it's a medical situation, you know, you just have to do what you have to do. And the same thing goes, as I said before, you know, if you see someone and what they seem to be having is a medical condition and nobody is like assigned and nobody is paying attention, then you do what you need to do. Okay. So I do want to give you some suggestions for building on your foundation, because at this point we're going to go through some of the praxis, but you should have a pretty good foundation that would allow you to build from there. So there's a lot of additional areas for exploration. There's so much more to learn. Like I said, we have touched on everything in kind of an introductory level, so that it can give you a foundation for your future growth. But any of the areas that we have touched on, you can go into more depth. So you can look at all sorts of different information on Wicca, on the different schools, a lot more about the, you know, the practices, the beliefs. There's also all of these other forms of contemporary paganism that we discussed briefly. There is a ton on deities, spirits, spirit work. There's all sorts of deep information on occult metaphysics. There's all sorts of information on various forms of high magic or operative magic. You can go into great depth in any of those things, and energy work and psychic development, any of that. There's also a number of systems that they're really full systems that, you know, you can learn. There's astrology, which you could call that a number. This could go into a number of different things, but I really think of it more as a system, because its ancient kind of understanding is that it is the study of Muera. It's the study of fate. So there's an entire huge, and there's multiple branches of it. That's an entire system. There's the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah is, you know, associated with Judaism, obviously, but it also has roots and becomes part of almost all of the Western ceremonial magical traditions and the alchemical traditions. There's what I'm putting here in quotes, shamanism. You know, officially the word shaman or shaman, it really is a word that comes out of the Sami people, and we're applying it to a much broader phenomenology of ways of working in the spirit worlds. But there's a lot of different stuff that you can learn about that, you know, falls under that general rubric of intentionally working in the spirit worlds with allies. Really, that's kind of what that is. It's particular modes. There's a whole bunch of traditions in ceremonial magic, and there's also alchemy or theurgy. So theurgy is the aspect of alchemy that really has to do with becoming a rarefied spirit, a rarefied, it's like instead of going from the dross to gold, what you're really doing is you're doing that within yourself. So the original theurgetical alchemy is in the Hellenistic period, and it's often associated with Hermes Trismegistus, and we have quite a bit there, like the Poimandres. We have some ancient texts around this, but there's a lot there in alchemy, and especially theurgetical alchemy, that has to do with spiritual evolution. And these are whole systems. Any one of these is an entire system. There's also a bunch of modalities that, you know, cut across a lot of different traditions and systems, such as healing, divination. There's so many different forms of divination. There's protection and warrior magic. There's, you know, various forms of visionary work, like creative visionary work, or kind of the work that is pulling in from the higher self. There's earth-based magic, there's kitchen witchery, there's bardic magic, there's just a ton of different modes. And then, you know, there's any of the in-depth study of any of the branches of allies, like, you know, there's the plants, that would be herbalism, stones, animals, nature spirits. Then there's the group of beings that are colloquially known as the fairies, or the fair people, the shining ones, the other crowd. You know, this is basically kind of, they're kind of cousins to humans. And then of course there's the theoi, the great ones. So there's lots of different in-depth study that you could go if any of those are particularly interesting to you. So that is the end of this theory class. And thank you all so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you in the praxis section for the final module.